So good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you to this joint work session with the Calvert County Board of Commissioners and the Calvert County Planning Commission on January the 17th, 2024. I'd like to ask everybody, please rise and repeat the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So if I could have a motion to approve the agenda.
Make a motion that we approve the agenda.
Second. I have a motion and a second that we approve the agenda. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. I have no public service announcements. I have with me tonight Vice President Commissioner Grasso, Commissioner Ireland, and Commissioner Cox. This is just a work session. At this time, I'll turn it over to Madam Chair.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Maria Bueller, and I am joined tonight by Vice Chair Kernan, Commissioner Freeland, Commissioner Gadway, Commissioner Toohey, Commissioner Dr. Holler, and Commissioner Williams is with us virtually. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. Okay, motion carries. Ready to begin?
Absolutely.
Good evening, Commissioners. Rachel O'Shea, Zoning Planner with the Department of Plans and Zoning, and with me is Will Hager, Planner 3. Go through an introduction to start. There we go. Where we were and now how we've gotten here today. We had an initial work session in April 2023, which gave an overview of the zoning ordinance, purpose, strategies, and goals of this update. The draft zoning ordinance was made available to the public in May of 2023. We had a joint work session public forum in June of 2023 on the draft zoning districts and draft zoning map. And we've had joint work sessions between the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners. And these will continue on a monthly basis to review all draft articles of the county zoning ordinance. We've also had public forums, and these are scheduled also on a monthly basis to allow the public opportunities to ask questions and comment on the proposed zoning ordinance articles. Planning and zoning staff have met with representatives from several organizations as well as citizens. Questions and comments received have been used to create an FAQ section and is on our zoning ordinance update webpage. On the webpage, you can also access the draft articles, the draft zoning map, where to send public comment, as well as supplemental materials. The focus of this evening's work session is draft article 25, site development and design standards. I'm going to turn it over to Will so he can take us through the major changes of this article.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and good evening, Commissioners.
Good
Good
evening.
evening.
And just one thing I wanted to quickly mention before I begin going over the slides. Typically, as part of these work sessions, we include public comments that have been sent to us and include them as part of the package that goes on the agenda. And the reason there are no public comments on the agenda for this work session is because we received no public comments. I just want to make sure that that's clear. And so Article 25, Site Development and Design Standards, it consists of things like site circulation standards for vehicles and pedestrians, design of residential subdivisions and development, on-site residential recreation requirements, design of non-residential development of previously recorded lots, requirements for age-restricted housing communities, and design of manufactured home communities. Another thing I just want to mention, for those who are unaware, we have been putting together documents which compare the draft zoning ordinance with the current zoning ordinance. And for those that would like to see how revised regulations compare directly with the current regulations, that document should be helpful. And that document is available on the zoning ordinance update website. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get into that level of detail with this presentation, or we would be here all night. But moving forward, we'll begin with on-site pedestrian and bicycle circulation. And the first thing I'd like to point out is in the draft zoning, or in the current zoning ordinance, the provisions of this section are located in separate residential and non-residential sections. In the draft, these sections have been consolidated and combined. There was a lot of repetition, that was the reason for that. But the provisions of this section in the draft apply to all residential and non-residential development unless otherwise specified. And so in the draft zoning ordinance, the sidewalk requirement for residential subdivisions has been revised and now states, in single-family detached residential developments, sidewalks shall be required along both sides of any proposed public road and along at least one side and preferably both sides of any proposed private road. Family conveyance access roads and residential developments in the Farm and Forest District and Rural Community District with fewer than 25 lots are exempt from this requirement.
So what's the current requirement?
I've got that in my notes in case you asked.
In case I ask.
So in the current zoning ordinance, the requirement for single-family detached subdivisions is the Planning Commission may require sidewalks in a subdivision created in any residential, commercial, or industrial district, and sidewalks may be required in residential subdivisions under the following circumstances: in subdivisions of 50 lots or more, and subdivisions that are part of a phased community, or in subdivisions that are linked to existing subdivisions by a road system that supports an existing sidewalk system, in subdivisions where the lot size average less than 1 acre, in subdivisions where RD5 road construction is required, or in subdivisions that contain recreation or amenities that encourage pedestrian activities. That's for single-family detached subdivisions. The current requirement for townhouse, single-family attached, multifamily, and mixed residential development is sidewalks are required along both sides of all streets. And for non-residential development, the current zoning ordinance states that sites shall be designed to discourage pedestrians and vehicles from sharing the same pathways and provide bicycle access.
So Will, whose responsibility is it to maintain the sidewalk?
I believe it's the responsibility of the property owner. That's, yeah.
And this new change would require sidewalks in any subdivision, minor or major.
The exception would be in the Farm and Forest District and the Rural Community District if it's less than 25 lots. So if it were in a residential district, and yes, that would be required.
And as Commissioner Freeland asked, we have had issues in the past of maintenance, long-term maintenance. So there's, when people buy these lots, there's language in there that they understand that they're required to maintain those sidewalks.
Yes, I believe that we do have that language in there.
Sometimes they don't read that part.
I believe it. So just a few other highlights from this section. We define the minimum width for sidewalks at 5 feet and the minimum width for multi-use paths as 8 feet, with the exception of when adjacent to arterial or collector roads where it's 10 feet. Sidewalks for multi-use paths required along the site frontage of existing or proposed public roads. Sidewalks or multi-use paths required to link residences with parking lots, recreation facilities, open space, parks, schools, institutional, commercial developments, and town centers. Sidewalks or multi-use paths, in addition to those adjacent to the road, required to connect cul-de-sacs and dead-end roads to create a more complete pedestrian circulation system.
And are there requirements for bike lanes in any subdivisions currently or proposed?
I don't believe that we have bike lane requirements in subdivisions, but that multi-use path, it's a multi-use, it's supposed to be accommodating for bicycle and pedestrian.
And we didn't get any comments asking to include those?
We received, I think for basically the month of December, we didn't have any comments come in.
Yeah, this past month, we didn't receive any, but
Mhm.
the department, as well as the Department of Parks and Recreation, when we were working on other plans, we've received a lot of comments regarding people want more sidewalks, more walkability. So this is us trying to work on implementing those things to give us more of that.
Yes, thank you, Rachel.
So you think in these design standards, it allows for multi-use of pedestrians and bicycles?
I'm sorry, can you?
I said, so you think that by having these additional widths, it can accommodate both pedestrians and bicycles? Is that the reason that they're widened? Seems like.
Yeah, and there are some additional requirements when we get to the recreation, on-site recreational requirements. There are requirements that were added for multi-use paths. So yes, we believe that what we have in here would be more accommodating for bicycles.
And Will, on the cul-de-sacs and dead-end roads, to understand that to where they won't be dead ends or cul-de-sacs anymore, because now you've got two lots, the end of a cul-de-sac and a path going between them? Is that what you're?
Not a dead end for pedestrians, but a dead end for vehicles, but
Right.
but not for pedestrians.
A lot of people look at cul-de-sacs and dead ends as being a benefit to live there because it limits the traffic flow and the people going in front of their property, but now putting in sidewalks or mandating sidewalks would put a sidewalk between two houses or two properties in a cul-de-sac is what I'm picturing. Is that?
Yeah, that's basically the idea, and I think that where that originally came from, I think that was a recommendation in the Prince Frederick, the draft Prince Frederick Master Plan, and it was an idea that we thought was interesting, and so we included in the draft as something to throw out there and see what the feedback was, if that was something that was people were interested in, and to go from there. But I do hear you on that.
Because a couple of months ago, we actually had a development come in here objecting to the sidewalks that were connecting their cul-de-sacs and their roadways around their development. And they came in as a community objecting to have, I believe, their bond released because it hadn't been done yet, and it had been a bunch of years, and they objected and didn't want the sidewalks in and out of their neighborhood.
Well, yeah, I don't think we're, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but
Okay.
I don't think we're, my visual is not in and out of the neighborhood, within the neighborhood.
Okay.
But I think, I would anticipate some people feeling that way.
Gotcha.
Me personally, I grew up in a neighborhood that did have that, and I liked it quite a bit. It's kind of neat if you want to hang out with your friend and they live in a cul-de-sac, you don't have to go 15 minutes around. You can just sort of cut through, and it's kind of, it makes, if you're a walker, it can make walking around the neighborhood a little bit more interesting and enjoyable. But that's just my opinion.
Right. Okay, thank you.
So, on-site vehicular circulation, the first section of Article 25 also includes provisions for vehicular circulation and road design, drive-through facilities, and stacking. The provisions of these sections were reviewed and revised with contributions from the Department of Public Works, and provisions in the current zoning ordinance which address construction criteria for roads have been removed at the request of the Department of Public Works, and those are removed in order to prevent the possibility of conflicts between the zoning ordinance and DPW's road ordinance. And in the next few slides, I'd like to highlight a few revisions added or revised related to site access. The following provision has been added to the draft zoning ordinance. residential developments that exceed 50 dwelling units and/or lots shall provide a minimum of 2 access points can be accessed by all units and/or lots. Residential developments that exceed 150 dwelling units and/or lots shall provide a minimum of 3 access points that can be accessed by all units and/or lots. The Planning Commission may waive this requirement due to environmental constraints. And I believe one of the primary reasons staff wanted to include this provision is emergency situations. If a resident of a community has a health emergency, or if there's a fire and it takes emergency vehicles extra time to reach their destination because of insufficient access, that could be the difference between life or death. So I think that's one of the major reasons why that was included. And the following provision was included in the draft zoning ordinance. Where a future roadway is designated on an approved county map, site plans and/or subdivisions for development adjacent to the designated roadway shall provide a platted connection to the future roadway and transfer that area by deed to the Board of County Commissioners of Calvert County for future development. If the future roadway is located within the parcel, it shall be platted and transferred by deed to the Board of County Commissioners of Calvert County at the time of final plat recordation. This replaces the following provision from the current zoning ordinance. Where a future roadway is designated on an approved county map, site plans for development adjacent to the designated roadway shall include provisions for future access to the roadway. So this is, I think, an example of a regulation where the revision doesn't necessarily change the spirit or the goal of the regulation, but it includes details that add clarity, whereas the regulation as currently written is vague enough that there could be other interpretations into how it could be applied. And the following provision was included in the draft zoning ordinance. If the adjacent property is not fully developed, adequate access shall be provided by a reserved platted future right-of-way with temporary construction easements and amenities easements for future road extension. The right-of-way for public or private road construction shall extend to the adjacent property. Upon development of the adjacent property, the developer of that adjacent parcel shall be responsible for building the road connection. Temporary easements for turnarounds shall be provided at the boundary lines. And there's a similar provision in the subdivision article of the current zoning ordinance, which this language would replace. The draft text is just worded a little bit differently. And in case anyone asks, I'll just go ahead. This is the provision from the current zoning ordinance. If a portion of a tract or an adjacent tract is not subdivided, suitable access to road openings for eventual extension of the roads shall be provided if A, either property is zoned town center or residential district, or B, either property has access to an arterial road, or C, such access is called for by the Calvert County Transportation Plan. So moving on to site design of residential developments, the focus of these slides is primarily on open space. So to start off, we'll address clustering. Clustering or clustered subdivisions is a development design technique that concentrates lots in specific areas on a site to allow the remaining land to be used for recreation, common open space, or the preservation of historically or environmentally sensitive features. And in this slide here, you can see a visual representation of that, with the traditional development on the left and the clustered development on the right.
Looks like high density to me.
Well, it's the same number, it's the same density, same number of lots. They're just clustered together.
Four more homes, I think.
Who's responsible for maintenance and upkeep of the open space in the clustered areas? Because it looks like the lot size, the individual owned lot sizes are reduced at that point.
So there was a proposal to change that ownership of open space provisions, but currently I believe that open space could be retained by the current owner, the developer, or could be sold to to anyone. So it's privately owned, or it could go to a homeowners association. It really depends. But we're gonna get to more of that in a minute.
Thanks.
Well, somewhere in the draft, and it may not be this section, but I remember the term gross area being used to determine the density or the number of dwelling units that could be placed on a parcel.
You're talking about gross acreage versus, gross tract acreage versus net tract acreage.
Yes.
And the net is when, before you do your density calculation, you subtract, I believe it's wetlands. And so currently, the density is calculated based off of the net tract acreage, which is a little bit lower than the gross typically if there's wetlands. That was changed to gross in the draft zoning ordinance, but I believe it's gonna be changed back to net when we get, when we revise this draft later in the year.
So my interpretation of that was, using gross, you could include all the acreage within the tract regardless whether it was steep slope or wetlands.
I think it's just wetlands that are subtracted, but yes.
And you say that is going to be changed back?
It was my understanding that,
Okay.
that's my understanding as of
Thank you.
now.
You don't subtract for roads?
That's not included in the net tract acreage calculation, no.
And there used to be a time when you did get some bonus lots if you clustered. Is that not true today?
I'm not sure if I was around for that.
You might not have been.
Yeah.
I'm old.
You might need to time travel, Will.
But you might be correct.
I think back when it first started, they were trying to encourage clustering, and you got like 10% or something more density if you clustered, but that's not true today.
Yeah, someone else in the department might know a little bit more about that.
But you would
And
know
it is something
current.
that we discussed during this process, but we decided against it.
So in your example, the traditional, there are 5 less lots in that one, 5 less homes. In the clustered subdivision, there are 5 more homes in there, but there's an abundance of open space. So when you go on in your presentation, would you emphasize the value to clustering and open space? Really accentuate that because I ran on no high density. I'm opposed to high density, and I want to know why clustering is such a good thing.
I believe it's 35 and 35. I went back and looked at it.
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't do a
It's
count
30
of this.
It's 35 on
This
each.
goes up to 35, this goes up to 40.
I didn't see the 40.
Yeah, it's 40, 5 more homes.
Oh, up on that other end, I'm sorry.
Yeah, up on that
Yeah.
other end. But there's a lot of open space, which is wonderful, but
Right.
5 more homes.
So in terms of density, the calculation stays the same. So it's, whether it's gross or net, it's, you get X amount of dwelling units for X amount of acreage. That doesn't change, whether it's clustered or not clustered. Now, if you could, if you have smaller lot sizes, maybe you could potentially squeeze,
Well, these are definitely
Yeah,
smaller
a
lot
little- maybe-
sizes because of the open space.
so maybe you could squeeze in
5 more homes.
an extra couple lots or
Mhm.
or something along those lines. I think that's possible.
So Will, could you talk to us about well and septic versus water and sewer on both these? So how are we gonna achieve our goal there?
Well, so in order, if you're not on, if you're not connected to public water or sewer, then you are limited in terms of your minimum lot size. So if you, unless you're essentially close to one of the town centers that have sewer and you're in an area that's planned for sewer, you're not gonna be able to get, I don't know what those lot size, what the actual square foot, you're not gonna be able to get tiny lots. You're not gonna be able to get anything below 30,000 square feet, what we have in the draft currently. I believe in the current zoning ordinance, it's 1 acre you need if you're on septic. So you are limited in terms of the amount of how low, how small you can go in terms of the lot size. You're limited if you are on septic. Is that?
I'm just trying to see how we're gonna achieve it, you know, with this, you know, restrictions and lot size and what have you. That's all.
Will, on the traditional, the vast majority of those lots are privately owned, privately taxed for all of the acreage that's in each individual plat. Going over to the clustered, this is going back to my other question, going over to the clustered, each individual property, whereas in traditional lot 25 might be 3 acres, lot 25 in the clustered is now 1 acre. So my question would then go, who owns the open space and pays taxes on the open space, or is that referred back to the county, or what? As far as that open space go, who would own that?
In the current ordinance, open space can be sold
Mm-hmm.
by the developer to anybody, to a private citizen, to the homeowners association. Whoever owns open space is responsible for the maintenance.
And use of it, they could use it however they
No,
wanted
well,
to
usually
within-
when open space is platted, it's platted into a category and there is restrictions. Like, we have like farmland open space where it continue to be farmed and you can put farm buildings. Or like a woodland reserve or habitat open space
Or
where
a
it's
hunting
restricted
reserve
to
or-
no building at all.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, so in the draft zoning ordinance, clustering of subdivision is not required in the residential district and the rural neighborhood district. And in the current zoning ordinance, clustering is not required in the residential district as well, or within the 1 mile radius or perimeter of town centers. And since the rural neighborhood district has been introduced to replace the 1 mile radius policy from the town centers of Dunkirk, Owings, Huntingtown, and St. Leonard, the draft zoning ordinance is consistent with the current policy in that way.
So is the density the same in the R&D and what it was in the 1 mile radius?
Yeah, again, we're not really talking about density in terms of that density formula.
But you changed you've changed the name, so you're gonna have to identify that in the zoning ordinance and
Yeah,
describe it.
yeah,
so-
the density for the rural neighborhood district is equivalent to the density that you can achieve in the rural community district within the 1 mile radius, which is 1 dwelling unit per acre.
So it's not gonna change?
No. So in the draft zoning ordinance, the clustering of subdivisions is required in the farm and forest district and the rural community district, with a few exceptions. And to your questions, Commissioner Grasso, the clustering requirements are required in the farm and forest district and the rural community district. So these are the more lower density residential zones. So these are already more rural, have a lower residential density that can be achieved compared to the more higher density areas like the residential district. Moving on with the slide, in the current zoning ordinance, in cases where all proposed lots are a minimum of 20 acres, clustering is not required in any zoning district. In the draft zoning district, clustering is not required for new lots created that are at least 25 acres in size in the farm and forest district, and in cases where the parcel being subdivided is less than 30 acres. clustering is not required in any zoning district. And in the draft, the required open space in clustered subdivisions in the Farm and Forest District is 80%, which is
Will,
ba-
I'm sorry. Clustering is not required in any zoning district. Where is clustering required?
So what this is, and I also included a chart that might be a little bit easier for people to visualize on a future slide. But what this is saying is that if you're in the Farm and Forest District, you're required to cluster, except if you create a lot, if you're creating lots that are greater than 25 acres in size, then you don't have to cluster. Or in any zoning district in the county, if you are starting with a parcel that's 30 acres or less, and you're subdividing that parcel, you're not required to cluster. If your parcel is greater than 30 acres, then that clustering requirement kicks in.
Thank you.
And so in the draft, the required open space in clustered subdivisions in the Farm and Forest District is 80%, which is basically consistent with the current policy. However, the open space requirement has been revised slightly for clustered subdivisions within the Rural Community District. In the draft zoning ordinance, at least 60% of the site must be designated open space, and lots and roads are to be clustered onto the remainder of the site in the Rural Community District. And in the current zoning ordinance, clustering buildings, lots, and roads onto no more than 50% of the site is required in the Rural Community District, unless located within that 1 mile radius or perimeter of a town center where clustering isn't required. And like I alluded to, this is just a chart where it's basically just another way of looking at the information that was presented in the previous 3 slides. However, one new thing included here is in the 3rd row in the 1st column. In the current zoning ordinance, subdivisions that are to be limited to no more than 5 lots are exempt from clustering requirements. My understanding is that one of the reasons for that being in the current zoning ordinance was to incentivize subdivisions of 5 lots or fewer. However, that provision predates the growth tier law that puts a cap on the amount of new lots that can be created at 7 lots in the tier 4, which is predominantly located in the FFD. So there's less of a reason to have that incentive, which is one of the reasons why that exception was not included in the draft.
So there is no restriction, even though 25 acres in the Farm and Forest District is exempt from clustering, there's no restriction from clustering should someone desire to do that.
As long as they're meeting the minimum lot size requirements, yes.
So I'm thinking, you know, an agricultural oriented area where there is a fairly large field, and it would benefit both the farming community and the developer to be able to cluster in a situation like that.
They, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I can understand that there's different situations for doing both.
Yeah, it's, I believe that we kept that exception in the Farm and Forest District because I think that there is some desire to be able to create those larger lots without having to cluster. So that's why that exception was included in there for the Farm and Forest District.
So if you're in tier 4 and you own 200 acres, you're allowed 7 lots, right?
If you're in the tier 4, the max you're gonna get is 7.
7. So if someone wanted to, they could do 7 1-acre lots, correct?
I believe that the minimum lot size in the FFD is 3.
So they could do 7 3-acre lots. They don't have to have 25-acre lots.
No, they don't.
They can if
Yeah.
they want to. which is, I think, what Mr. Freeland was
Yes, they,
trying to get to.
yeah, they, just because they're not required to cluster doesn't mean they can't, as long as they're meeting their minimum lot size requirements, they can go ahead.
And I think if we could figure a way to incentivize that without adding density, we should think about that. Because at the end of the day, I don't think any of us would like to see 7 25-acre lots on those 200 acres and, but, you know, understanding the real estate market and how things are, there's value to having large lots. And so if we could maybe try to think about a way to incentivize that without adding density, might be an option we could throw out there for people. Try to save some open space.
Okay.
Just food for thought.
In that, in Commissioner Hans's scenario of 200 acres with 7 3-acre lots, you now still have 179 acres of farmland or open space, as you would call it, that could be farmed, and that's where I was going back to. So can a farmer, or can a farmer with 200 acres generate those 7 3-acre lots, sell those, and then continue to farm the other 179 acres
Sure.
as open space?
And he can sell that residue, and that's already happened in Calvert County, where neighboring farmers have bought that residue. Can't be developed, but it can be farmed. And that has already occurred and can occur.
But it cannot be built on. Can that be, is that automatically considered, well, that's exempt from any building, as you mentioned earlier.
Well, I don't think it's exempt from.
I'm sorry, not exempt. I meant that, wrong word. You can't build on it.
So there are different categories of open space. One of them, if you designate it as a farm reserve, there are certain agricultural structures that can be permitted on an open space.
I've seen the term non-buildable residue used.
It's non-buildable for terms of residential building or even commercial, but if it's, I mean, if you're gonna build farm structure.
But we have seen instances where land that was labeled non-buildable became buildable, which is something I think we're supposed to address in this ordinance update. Because people have had the misconception that I bought a lot next to a non-buildable lot, and then all of a sudden something gets built on it.
It came up in this drafting process, and language was put in there to address that very situation.
It's a little misleading, so we need to be as transparent as we can.
We agree? And so a provision was added to the draft zoning ordinance that should be highlighted. For subdivisions with 25 or more lots, the draft zoning ordinance requires the developer convey the open space on the final plat to the Subdivisions Incorporated Homeowners Association and ensure that the open space will be protected by legal arrangements sufficient to assure their maintenance and preservation for their intended purpose. Subdivisions with 25 or more lots is also the threshold where recreational amenities are required to be installed by the developer in the draft zoning ordinance. That's why the 25 was chosen as the threshold for that. As we went over a minute ago, in the current zoning ordinance and also in the draft, excuse me, let me restart that sentence. In this draft, for subdivisions of fewer than 25 lots, any parcel of open space which is not retained by the owner of record at the time of subdivision may be sold or otherwise conveyed to any individual, organization, or governmental entity, provided the open space is conveyed in sections not less than 20 acres in size, unless the total sum of the open space is less than 20 acres, in which case the open space is required to be conveyed in whole. So in the draft, that policy applies to subdivisions with fewer than 25 lots. That is the current policy, what I just said, that is the current policy for all subdivisions. In the draft, if it's 25 or more lots, then it would be required to be conveyed to the homeowners association.
So we'll oftentimes the permanent stormwater structures are built in the open space areas and end up being conveyed to either homeowners association or a private individual who has no idea that they're taking on the responsibility of maintenance of a stormwater structure. The language on the first bullet point here talks about being protected by legal arrangements sufficient to assure their maintenance and preservation for the intended purpose. Does that cover the stormwater structure? And how does that work?
That's another good question. I believe that my memory is a little bit fuzzy on this. I believe that we discussed stormwater and open space at some point, but I'm not sure if we included anything specific to address what you are bringing up. So I think that that's probably something that we're gonna have to discuss.
Oh,
But that is partly why we are proposing that these open spaces be transferred over to a homeowners association to make sure that there is proper maintenance put forth for these areas.
Unfortunately, there's some history where homeowners associations have dissolved because of the liability of maintaining a broken stormwater system.
And when the systems have failed, it's affected adjacent properties, and then you do have a complete.
And then they come to us. So
It's
Commissioner
not-
Freeland's correct. They get turned over, but the HOA doesn't understand the responsibility.
I think JR's
And
gonna-
I mean, I, in my experience, and I presented a paper at an EPA conference many years ago regarding the same matter, and it's basically the same thing going on. In situations where, the stormwater structure is built on a private lot, and somebody buys that lot thinking they've got a nice little pond, to only find out 10 years later that there was a considerable amount of maintenance required to maintain the stormwater structure as it was designed. That needs to be provided up front, so that folks know what they're taking on.
Director?
JR, with Director Department of Public Works.
Good morning, Commissioner. JR, Director of Public Works. So, Commissioner Freeland, you're right. So currently, the way the majority of the stormwater for subdivisions or even commercial lots, they are built on open space, especially in subdivisions. There is maintenance agreements that's generally signed by the developer that says they will maintain it. Generally, they're usually given over to the homeowner association, like a lot of the open space with the documents. The county Public Works has a policy where we go out and basically inspect these devices. If they're not functioning or have not been maintained, which we do find a lot, especially the ones with the homeowner association, or even the ones that are on private lots, that still have stormwater easements on them, we generally end up having to give them a letter and tell them they're basically in non-compliance and they have to maintain it. And we found basically what you said is, it becomes an issue because one, they didn't know they had to maintain it, whether it be the homeowner association or the private. So it is a concern that we probably need to address, somehow. I know that other counties have found ways where, sometimes they provide easement to the county to maintain them, but I don't know if we necessarily want to go down that path, because now that increases our operating cost and everything for all taxpayers to maintain a stormwater device for a certain individual subdivision. So I think a lot of it might come down to how, I guess you would say, the open space is presented to the people that purchase a lot, and maybe, there's some title searches that can be done to maybe, I guess, say, provide the information to the current property owner, the new property owner. And I'm not sure if that's something we can write in the zoning ordinance or not, but that's currently how it's handled.
But, it sounds like somebody's taking a pretty good shot at this with this language that's in this first bullet point. Protected by legal arrangements sufficient to assure their maintenance and preservation.
Well, I mean, our stormwater maintenance agreements we currently have now, you could say, is a pretty good attempt to have a legal arrangement so they're maintained correctly. But if you don't know that that's there, because when the subdivision is done, generally the developer is the one that creates and signs and records that maintenance agreement when the plats are recorded. So in 5 years, when that open space is turned over to the homeowner association, if they're not made aware of that, they're not gonna know. because they're not the ones signing the agreement. Same thing with the property owner that might buy lot 10 of the subdivision that has a stormwater facility on it that you think's a beautiful pond. You might not know that's a stormwater device that you now have to maintain.
So we have a device in place to notify home buyers of the county's right to farm. We should have something in place to notify a home buyer or homeowner association that what they're getting ready to either accept or purchase has maintenance responsibilities up front. And question on the inspections, JR. How often is the stormwater structures required to be inspected?
Well, we're required by Maryland Department of Environment to inspect stormwater devices every 3 years. So we inspect them when they're constructed, we inspect them 1 year after construction, and then we're required every 3 years.
So how is it some of these structures have gone a longer than 3-year period without having any maintenance done to them if they're supposed to be inspected every 3 years?
I'm sad to say that it probably hasn't been enforced as it should have been for many reasons. A lot of the reason is lack of personnel, from what I've seen since I've been with the county. But we do have a stormwater inspector on staff, and we have been meeting the requirements we need to date to inspect these devices.
So would you agree the longer a structure goes without having an inspection, the more costly it could be to bring it into compliance?
It could be, and even the ones that haven't been maintained like they probably should have been, they're still holding up pretty good. And when I say that, it's like, you know, if it's an older pond, the dams are generally still in decent shape. The outfall structures are generally in decent shape. And that's probably the biggest cost to maintenance. But what we're finding is they're overgrown. So it should be an open pond, but now we got a little bit of sediment in there. We got trees growing in there that shouldn't have been. So those have to be removed, which is still costly, but it's not as bad as complete repair. And that's what we're finding with most of the older ponds or facilities that we're getting. They're just overgrown, more or less, just because no one's removed the vegetation as they should.
You know, it's a whole lot easier to mow a 1-inch sapling than it is a 12-inch diameter tree.
Most definitely.
Thank you.
So did I hear you say, Director, that the developer has to sign a maintenance agreement to maintain the stormwater?
When the subdivisions are created and there's easements created over them, there is a stormwater maintenance agreement that is signed, and generally it's by the developer.
So when that device is transferred to an HOA, shouldn't that HOA have to sign that maintenance agreement with the county, so then they know that they are required to maintain
I
it?
think there's language in the agreement that basically says that, you know, the developer signing it as the one to maintain it, but that'll pass on to any heirs or anybody that requires the property thereafter.
I understand that that's what it says today. I think what I'm saying is that moving forward, we should require a new signature so that those people clearly understand that when they take over that open space, there are responsibilities, so that we don't hear, I didn't know, and when they get a bill for $100,000, they can't afford to pay it. At least they know up front and they can plan and prepare for that.
Agreed.
So maybe, and that's not a part of the zoning ordinance, but maybe it's something we can look at for you for the maintenance agreements
Will do.
as we move forward.
Will
Thank
do.
you.
You're welcome.
Thank
Are
you.
the developers required to put up a bond, like a stormwater management bond prior to building those?
Yeah, so at time of construction, we require a stormwater management bond, and currently it's at 125% of the estimated construction cost.
And when is that released?
Usually it's released after one construction is done, 2 as-built are submitted, inspections are done, and we accept that it was built per the plan, and we have as-built on record how it was constructed. And then we release it, and usually it goes into a maintenance bond after that for an additional year, and then we release the maintenance bond.
And do HOAs, are they required to submit a maintenance bond?
No. After that year's up, there's no maintenance bond required, as it currently is written in the stormwater ordinance.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, JR. Okay, we're going to move forward with on-site residential recreation requirements. And one thing I just want to mention before we get into the details with these slides, the section on residential recreation requirements was reviewed by the Department of Parks and Recreation, and recommendations from Parks and Rec were included in this draft. And in the current zoning ordinance, the residential recreation requirements are located in separate articles and sections depending on whether it's a single-family detached or a multifamily or townhome. In the draft, these sections have been combined and consolidated into one section, again, to reduce repetition, and the provisions of this section apply to all residential development unless otherwise specified. So, in the draft zoning ordinance, single-family detached developments with 25 or more lots must provide neighborhood recreation on site, and land suitable for neighborhood recreation must be provided at a minimum of 950 square feet per lot in total. In the current zoning ordinance, subdivisions with 50 or more lots must provide neighborhood recreation on site, and a minimum of 800 square feet per dwelling unit must be provided for neighborhood recreation. In terms of the required recreational green space, there are a certain amount of fields that are required to be provided, and there are minimum standards for those fields, such as 10,000 square feet per field, at least 100 feet by 100 feet, et cetera. In the draft zoning ordinance, the number of fields required for recreational green space is determined by multiplying the total number of dwelling units by 400 square feet and dividing this total by 10,000 square feet. The total number of required fields equals the whole number in the dividend. In the current zoning ordinance, it's the same equation, but the calculation begins by multiplying the total number of lots or units by 150 square feet. And just to clarify, that 400 square feet is a part of the 950 square feet overall mentioned on the previous slide. So roughly 40% of the total square footage of recreation required is provided in the form of green space, and the remaining square footage is to be applied to other recreational facilities. And I just want to mention a few other provisions relevant here. The following provision was added to the draft. Fields designated as recreational green space should generally be consolidated into a single area, but may be divided for more equitable distribution into two areas if the subdivision contains 50 or more residential lots. Another provision that was added, recreational green space shall be located on cleared land and level to a degree suitable enough for playing on the field. The grade shall have a maximum 3% slope. And another provision that was added, if athletic fields such as baseball fields or soccer fields, et cetera, are proposed to meet the recreational green space requirements, development plans, including but not limited to field dimensions and field specifications, shall be approved by the director of the Department of Parks and Recreation or their designee.
Has there ever been a time where fees in lieu could be collected instead of providing the space?
Do you know?
Mary Beth may be able to answer that.
Yes, there absolutely was. Historically, I don't think we have that anymore. Carolyn would be a great one to ask. Unfortunately, she's under the weather this evening, but we can follow up with you on that.
So where I'm going with this, the county commissioners are struggling to develop the Harry Elizabeth Brown Recreation Park, or Recreation Center and Park, or I think is what it's called. And we're gonna have an enormous amount of development within walking distance of that location. It looked like it would be appropriate to allow the developer to add money to the development of this facility instead of having to put something in right next door to it.
So that would be something to consider with the town center zoning ordinance. Absolutely, we can consider something like that. If they are in a town center where there is a park, it would be worth contributing to that park instead of building additional facilities. And maybe it's an offset of, 50%. You provide 50% of what's required and 50% in fees in lieu. Something to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And And so in the current zoning ordinance, at minimum, recreational green space, hard surface courts, and many parks and townhome or multifamily developments are required to be provided. The draft zoning ordinance allows a little bit more flexibility in terms of the types of recreational facilities that can be provided after a minimum amount of recreational green space. So if the developer wants to provide things like community garden plots, fitness trails, or picnic pavilions, instead of hard surface courts, they could do that. And in the draft, if playgrounds are provided, minimum standards have been added. They include things like a minimum size requirement of 1,800 square feet, play structures for children of all ages, prohibition on wood products and play equipment, at least 2 benches and shade trees to be provided, and a minimum distance of 200 feet from residences. And there are no minimum standards for playgrounds in the current zoning ordinance.
Are you talking about recreation space within a development?
Yes, this is within.
Strictly development?
Strictly within.
This isn't Dunkirk Park? This
No,
is-
this is strictly within a subdivision development or
And
a
who keeps
residential
that up?
development.
The HOA keeps that up? An HOA would keep that up?
Yeah, the previous slide that requires
Mhm.
the open space to be transferred to the HOA is 25 lots. That is in sync with when the recreational amenity requirements kick in.
Okay, thank you.
And a few more notes on on-site residential recreation, a few other provisions that were added to this section. A provision added that clarifies that recreational green space cannot be located in the center of cul-de-sacs or traffic circles. Added provisions requiring benches and shade trees to be installed for recreational green space in certain recreational facilities. A provision added requiring hard surface multi-use paths as an interconnected system linking residential units with recreational facilities, parks, and the various categories of open space. Added provisions requiring residential developments with 100 or more lots or dwelling units to provide a minimum of 10 square feet of indoor community space per lot or dwelling unit. And we'll wrap things up with archaeological and historic significance. In the current zoning ordinance, the provisions protecting structures and sites with historic significance for residential subdivisions and townhomes, attached dwelling, or multifamily development are located in separate sections and are worded and are substantively different. In the draft, these provisions have been consolidated and are located in one section. In the current zoning ordinance, the provisions protecting structures and sites with historic significance applies only to residential development. In the draft zoning ordinance, these provisions would apply to residential development as well as all development requiring site plan approval. And provisions have been added addressing pre-existing cemeteries and development occurring along a designated historic roadway in order to preserve the historic character of the landscape as viewed from the road. And so in summary, we have revisions to on-site pedestrian circulation requirements. Provisions in the current zoning ordinance which address construction criteria for roads have been removed. Revisions to site access requirements, revisions to some clustering and open space provisions, subdivisions of 25 or more lots required to convey open space to homeowners association, and revisions to requirements for on-site residential recreation, and revisions to archaeological and historic significance provisions. And so I think we've already had a little bit of a discussion, but at this time, staff requests that the commissioners discuss draft Article 25 and direct staff regarding any additional recommended considerations or options to include in the draft for public input.
Well, it infers on the previous page that any development with 25 acres or 25 lots or more, do I read that it's mandated to have an HOA? If it's got open space?
Yes, that was, let me go back to, yes.
It was page 22.
Yes, and then page 16, which I just brought up in more detail. Yes, if the subdivision is of 25 or more lots, then it is required in the draft, as it's currently written, to convey the open space on the final plat to the Subdivisions Incorporated Homeowners Association. And that is a change.
That's ownership of the open space. So any lot or any subdivision with 25 or more lots is now gonna be mandated by the county to have an HOA in perpetuity?
And the 25 lots is also when the recreational amenities kick in as well. So that's why the 25 was
Okay.
was chosen, but yes, that is a change.
And so if the HOA goes defunct, then what happens then?
Well, then you've got a situation.
Good answer, Will. Good answer.
Thank you, Will.
That's true.
You got good laughter 2 months in a row. I'll give you credit on that.
With the proposed change, it doesn't change from what happens currently, other than the open space that is in the hands of a private citizen. We still have situations where HOAs can go belly up, and communities have issues taking care of their requirements in terms of maintenance from recreational standpoint or open space standpoint. We're not saying that whether, communities today are in existence and have these problems, that those problems are gonna go away or we're gonna create more. We have issues with open space being owned by private citizens, more so than the ones that are owned by homeowners associations, which is why the department decided to propose this change, given our history over the years of dealing with issues in communities of what private citizens want to do with their open space, because they think it's any other land and they own it, so they should be able to do whatever they want. And it's not the case, because the open space was put there for the benefit of the subdivision. So yeah, I mean, it's not a perfect solution moving forward. It's definitely something that could continue to be worked on. But it's a difficult one, because
Right.
you do want to provide benefits and amenities for communities, and they want that. But then how to make sure that they're maintained over time and through the years in the future is difficult.
Thank you.
Will, back on page 8, could we go back to the last sentence and just clarify that for me, please?
The planning commission may waive this requirement due to environmental constraints.
Yes.
I think that there are some instances where you might have wetlands that might block an access point where it's just not feasible.
So we'll go back to 2, or it would be other restrictions placed on the site.
I think that that's probably something that would be worked out in the review process.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's a blanket answer to that.
I just didn't want to be stuck to the environmental
Yeah, I
side,
think
you know,
at that
that's
point
a
it would
good
be up
point.
to
that-
the developer and the engineers, as well as all of the reviewers, taking a look at the site and seeing what works, and bringing maybe a couple of options to the planning commission for consideration.
Okay, thank you.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just have a question. Am I clear, that these proposed draft zoning ordinance, if approved, will any of the subdivisions, that are in the pipeline, say either at concept plan or submittal, or bare minimum concept plan approval is grandfathered for these changes, or how does that work? At what point, do you cut it off if they're approved?
Right, yes, we certainly we haven't discussed that yet, but normally, same as when we deal with text amendments, there usually is a grandfather grace period with site plans and projects that are already in the door, versus something that hasn't come through yet. So yes, when this is hopefully adopted in the future, there will be provisions that go along in the adoption language that will have some sort of grandfathering.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think, sounds like everyone's got their questions out of their system. So, I'll move on to the last slide. So, just an FYI, we have an open public comment period for draft articles 18 and 19 from January 5th to February 2nd. And we have a public forum scheduled for next week, January 25th, located here at the HEB. That begins at 7 p.m. And our next joint work session is scheduled for February 21st. And I believe that's all I have. So, thank you, commissioners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So at this time, we're going to open it up for public comment. Mr. County Attorney.
Thank you. The board adopted a resolution in 1989 intending to maintain the order and decorum of the governmental process. A copy is found at the table as you enter the room. By Resolution 51-20, persons are welcome to address the Board of County Commissioners on any matter germane to the business of county government. Persons addressing the board shall refrain from statements, remarks, or conduct that is uncivil, rude, vulgar, profane, or otherwise disruptive to the conduct of the board's business. All speakers are asked to identify themselves, whether speaking as an individual will be allocated 2 minutes or as the appointed spokesperson of a group where you be allocated 5. For those attending virtually, if you wish to speak, please press *9 or use the raise your hand function. The Ethics Commission's asked us to remind speakers of public comment that lobbyists include those who seek to influence public policy, and lobbyists are required to register in advance. Is there anyone in the room who wishes to speak? Please make your way to the microphone.
Okay, my name is Bob Estes, and I'm speaking as a member of Friends of Hunting Creek, and you all took away almost my entire speech with your questions, because I had similar issues with that slide. Well, for me, it looked like slide 16, but it's how do we pay for these stormwater management systems and other systems? It's similar to roads in many respects, if you think about it. Fixing a road in the ranch estates required special taxation district. Maybe that's how you keep this thing alive. Because what happened in my HOA is everybody moved there. They're all young. Their kids all played together. Then the kids left, and they didn't have any more picnics or anything, and the HOA went away. And I think that's pretty common. Not everywhere, but you can't rely on people that own houses third time over to keep those HOAs going. You probably have to have something a little more special than that to assure it. Because guess what? New stormwater management systems and new roads probably aren't the problem. It's when they get old. So that's when they start needing not just maintenance, but yeah, maybe even repair, maybe even replacement, because maybe they're just not doing what we need them to do to protect our environment. Well, let's see if there's anything I can salvage from my prepared words here. So, just like you all, I wondered about this whole problem with who's responsible for what. You have all kinds of groups. You've got developers. You've got HOAs. You've got individual citizens. You've got the county. And what I can see in a cartoon is everybody's pointing like this at the other person, and that's kind of been what has happened a lot. We don't have money in the county to fix what we have. And for instance, the senior center repair here in Prince Frederick took 3 decades to get fixed and required grant money. There's other things out there, behind the state building. There's failures. That'll probably never get done, because I think they have all of their fingers pointing at each other, not just one each. So what do you do about these loopholes and these things that have been ignored? I'll tell you what, the environment knows it's happening. Ask any waterman what silt does to the grass out in the creeks and out in the rivers. What does that do to the fisheries? Nothing good, I'll tell you that. Doesn't help anything. Still recovering, like probably half the people in this room, I'd suspect. You know, you hear me talking about stormwater management systems over and over and over again, and you might think that I'm not going to speak about it tonight, but I am again. One of the best ways to reduce the cost of these things and the failures is to design them, first of all, not just to old standards that don't fit, not just to today's rainwater that's falling. What about in 30 years, what are you looking at? Well, it's hard to predict, isn't it? And I know that there's some attempt to predict it, but you want these systems to last for 30 years, 40 years, maybe longer. You don't want them to fail with every little blip over your design standards. Try fixing something like this. Which is cheaper? Build it a little bit stronger than it has to, or go back and fix it? Would you buy a tractor like that? No, you want a tractor that's gonna hold together, that does more than you ask it to. And I know sometimes you probably do more than you should, but you want something tough. You don't wanna be fixing it. You want it to keep going and going and going. Same with these stormwater management systems. And you'll hear people telling you, well, that's too expensive to do it. Is it? Which is more expensive? Fixing it, repairing it? And if you build it stronger, who gets to pay for that? Well, it might be the developer. If you don't, who gets to pay for it? Might be everybody in this room, might be you guys that hold the purse. That's not fair. So build it a little stronger, build it to higher standards, and it'll last longer, and maybe you're not gonna suddenly have people declaring bankruptcy because suddenly there's a bill for $100,000 to fix a little stormwater management system. So that's pretty much about all I've got to say. Although I did find it a little bit odd that you're going to have every individual homeowner fix the sidewalk in front of his house. That probably isn't the way you want to do it. So anyway, that's me, right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Susan DeZurek, and I live in Huntingtown, and I'm speaking for myself this evening. Couple of comments. One on what I heard here this evening is the state legislature a couple of years ago made it mandatory for certain HOAs and associations, community associations, to have a reserve study done. And that happens every few years. And I happen to know that this year they're going to be amending it because there was no way to implement that legislation. And one of the ideas that I have for the stormwater management, the costs of those for the HOAs, is that that is rolled into their reserve study. Because then once they have the study, then they have to put together the money, start saving that money and put it into account that can only be used for that purpose. So that would be something to look into. The second thing, and also one other thing, is as a former president of a HOA, realtors are required to get the legal documents to be able to give to the prospective buyers so that they know what's in there. But it would be really nice if somehow there would be legislation that they're also required to go over it and make sure that they have read this, because there are some developments that are going to be going in here in Calvert County that could put owners into bankruptcy. If retaining walls blow out and they are required to repair those, they're not allowed to turn over, in this community, not allowed to turn over the roads, so they're going to be responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of those. This particular community is going to have a community center, pool, just the community center. If they have to replace a roof or they have to replace the HVAC system, that could be devastating to the people that are part of that HOA that have to pony up for all that money to keep that property going. My last item is that Tuesday morning at 7:30, I read over the posted agenda and the presentation for this hearing. There were 2 slides on planned unit developments, PUDs, in the presentation. At 2:30 that
Sorry, ma'am.
afternoon,
Ms. Dessert, your
Yes.
time is up, but if you could please wrap up your comments.
I will very quickly.
Thank you.
At 2:30 that afternoon, I went back to look at it to share it with members of Keep Calvert Country, and it was gone. And my question is how did that get on the agenda? Who put it into this presentation, and how was it then removed? And I think that the citizens of this county deserve to have an explanation of what's going on. Who has a personal agenda to get that back on the agendas here? Thank you.
Is there anyone
Thank
else
you.
in the room? And there are 3 virtual participants, and none of them have raised their hands, so I believe that's it.
So I think that concludes our joint work session tonight. I want to thank everybody for coming out and participating. We do appreciate your participation, but this process is long, and this is a draft. It's going to change as we work through, based on your comments and what we hear and the questions that we ask. So don't be surprised if things change along this process. That's what it's all about. For us, we're going to conclude, so at this time, it's for a motion to adjourn.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to adjourn. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Madam Chair?
Thank you very much. So I could have a motion for us to take a brief recess, and then we will return for our regular meeting.
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.